Hello, everyone. This is Stacy. Welcome to The Landing. Over the past couple of months, we have been discussing Joel Hancock's newest book, The Education of an Island Boy, and today we bring that conversation gently to a close. This is our third conversation with Joel, and if you've been listening along, you know this isn't just a book. It's a remembering. It's laughter tucked between hard-earned lessons, humor that sneaks up on you, and a deep, steady pride in the place and people that shaped him. Joel has a special way of telling stories that feel very comfortable and handed down as if they are shared at the end of a long day, honest, unpolished, and full of heart. In this conversation, we lean fully into that heritage, that groundedness, where humor and humility walk hand in hand, and where growing up down east becomes an education you carry for life. This is a fitting close to a story that reminds us who we are, where we are from, and why those roots still matter. I'm grateful to share this space once more with Joel Hancock. Let's finish this wonderful conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Landing. Today is a beautiful day for many reasons. One, the sun is out. Two, I'm on Harkers Island. And three, I have one of my favorite human beings sitting across from me. So if you will remind us of your name and who's your crowd and where you're from, kind sir.
Thank you, Stacy. I'm Joel Hancock. I'm from the island, lived there all of my life, except for the few years while I was away in college. I'm from the same family that Stacy is.
Yep.
So she's one of my favorite people too. I haven't known her all of my life, but she has known me all of her life.
Yes, sir.
Because she's a generation after me and stuff. Her mother is my double cousin, so we're uniquely close to each other. And so Stacy has followed in a path that I hope that I have helped to blaze about trying to preserve the past on the island to help us appreciate more who we are and what is expected out of us in life.
Absolutely. Well, if you have joined us in the past, then you know that we have had the privilege of having Joel on to talk about a very special project that he has completed. And today we want to touch on the last third of this project, if you will.
Oh, okay. And she's referring to the book, I guess.
Yes. And go ahead and tell us a little bit about the book and about maybe even the sales and the distribution thus far, like how things gone.
It's called The Education of an Island Boy, and a subtitle Growing Up on Harkers Island in the 50s and 60s, though some of the stories obviously relating to my parents come before that, and I tell about them in the context of the life that I've known since then. And so it is not uniquely limited to the 50s and 60s, but all of the stories have a basis there in the 50s and 60s. It was published a year ago this past December, in December of 2024, just before Waterfowl Weekend, and so we had it ready for that. The first 1,000 copies sold out pretty quickly, and we're on the second 1,000 now. Most of them have been sold here through the museum. They did so much, and especially Karen, in helping me get it ready, get it published, and other things related to that we've had almost a unique arrangement that almost all of the sales have been there. I have spoken to some local book clubs and stuff, and the History Museum in Moorhead and the Beaufort Historical Society have sold a few copies as well, and it is available on Amazon in both Kindle and in hardback and paperback. But almost all of the sales have come through the museum. as I said, that we're in the second publishing printing now, and obviously I don't think this one will go as fast as the first one, but I do have plans, and I'll talk about that later. That Karen has that she wants to do a son of a follow up on. So that's something that I'll talk about later on.
Okay, very good. Now, Joel, this isn't your first book,
No,
right? So
no.
just real quickly, tell us a little bit about the first one, because I love that one.
The first book, which was published in 1990, was called "Strengthened by the Storm: The Early Mormons of Harkers Island, North Carolina," because of that culture that I and you grew up in. Dates back to the beginning of Harkers Island at the turn of the 19th century, and it was an interesting, dynamic, even in some ways exciting story about how they came and established themselves here, and then the opposition that arose. The church was burned, the Mormon missionaries were evicted from the island, but then allowed back. And I was able to get the journals, which all missionaries at that time and even now are required to keep. I was to get the journals of the elders that were here, and was able to pinpoint days and events and stuff that had come down to me as just stories that were embedded in the memory of those first and second generation Mormons on the island. And so that was my first experience of getting a book printed. But by the way, it was different in night and day now.
Yeah.
H.L. Mencken once said that there's no such thing as freedom of the press unless you happen to own one. Well, in the modern digital age, with publishing, electronic publishing and stuff, everybody does own one. And so it's so much easier than it was in 1990 to get something published.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, thank you for that, because I love that one too. Okay, so how have the dynamics of the island changed?
Well, in the last chapter of my book is dedicated to that. And that would take a whole discussion to talk about not just the physical nature of the island, but also that the population of the island, how it's changed. I grew up in a world when everybody was related to each other through those earliest visitors and stuff. And now that's not the case. I mean, I'm told that most of the electric bills for homes on the island are sent to zip codes other than 28531. So most of the houses on the island are not owned by the people that stay here all the time. A lot of summer homes and vacation homes.
Right.
In 1970, I mentioned this in the book, that the 1970 census showed almost 2,000 people on the island living in 1,000 homes. And the 2020 census showed only 1,000 people, permanent residents on the island, living in 2,000 homes.
Oh my
I mean,
goodness.
that there's that many homes, but they're not all occupied by people who live here all the time. So that in itself tells something about the difference. But I go through some other things that related to stories told in the books, how there's no more Hancocks at Hancock Landing. There's no more Willises at Red Hill. And there's no fish houses on the island and things of that sort. I'm not being critical. I'm just showing how it has changed and hopefully how it has evolved and will continue to evolve.
Right. And that's the only thing we can hope, right? Yeah. Now, in this section of the book, you talk about a lot of special people. Some men and women that you speak of. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, in writing the book and in talking about the book, I realized it is the people. As beautiful as this island is and how it's situated in a unique place and stuff, it's the people that have made it what it is. And the dynamics of the generations of people, one that followed each other, is what sets it apart. And so, but there were people that were individual examples of things that you could find in almost every family, and some that were fairly unique that I want to point out. And so I have 3 chapters donated to just individual stories about individuals that I knew grew up, that everyone on the island was pretty much knew about, and that you could, for a long time, you could refer to a certain story and everyone would know who you were talking about. Now, I have one of the chapters is called Kith and Kin, Women and Men, and it's about people in that neighborhood that I grew up in around Hancocks, Willises, Guthries, and Moores, where everybody was from those 4 families, and some of the unique people, some of them that you may even remember from later on, and some of them that had already begun to fade in memory by the time I grew up. But everyone, if someone mentioned Brady Lewis, you knew what they were talking about, even if you hadn't known him personally.
Exactly.
Like, for example, in my neighborhood, 10 years older than me was a guy named Dallas Daniel, who ran a store, but he was like the island veterinarian. I mean, he was the one, if your dog or something, your horse, whatever it was sick, Dallas Daniel was the one you either went to or called to. And he lived in an extended adolescence. He was 10 years older than me, but by the time I came along, all of the neighborhood kids of my age gathered at his store. And 10 years later, the generation after me was gathering at his store, because he just had this unique personality, as I said, that he remained an adolescent long, even into his 30s, and he had stories, and there were things about him that were oh so interesting, and he had a way of making everything seem as if it had never happened before. And I could give some examples, and I do in the book, but there's no one in my age group who on the island who couldn't tell a story about being at Dallas Daniel's store. Another was who lived right across the road from me. Dallas Daniel lived across the road, 3 houses down, but directly across the road was my cousin Paul Hancock, which would have been your mother's first cousin as well. Paul was about maybe 5 or 6 years older than me, but I hung around with him a lot because he loved chickens, and he loved playing games, and he loved having a pack of boys around him, so that he was sort of like a leader of the pack. And he always had wonderful stories, and his specialty was hyperbole. Everything wasn't, you've heard this expression, the greatest, the most that's ever been.
Yes.
Or way yonder more, to express things. But for example, he told about being on his way to a rooster fight. That's a story in and of itself, down on the South Carolina border, and running into a mule that destroyed his daddy's car. And he told us that this was weeks later. He said that he woke up every morning with mule hair still in his teeth. I mean, obviously that wasn't true, but he was expressing, you know what he meant by it.
Right.
There was in my neighborhood from my generation and a half before me, Donald Guthrie. We called him Redheaded Donald. And he can make every event in his life almost like a situation comedy. From
Hilarious.
Working at the landing, running horses on the banks, running sheep at core banks. And I mean, that was one of his specialties, was he loved to run. And then, so when he was drafted in the Army in World War II, he was put in the infantry. And one of the stories often told about him is that in boot camp, before they shipped him overseas, they had to go on a 20-mile hike. And it is said that the sergeant stopped the platoon to rest at 10 miles. And Donald went up pumping his legs and arms, telling the sergeant, "We ain't going to get anywhere if you stop every 10 miles. But that was a guy that was used to running 5 and 10 miles every morning on the banks and stuff, or herding sheep and things. And then some of the older people was my daddy's aunt by marriage, Gracie. She was a Hamilton by birth, but she was a Willis. But she had married Rennie Willis. And Rennie was my daddy's uncle. And that home was sort of a gathering place for her family, and because she had a big extended family on both sides. And so everyone gathered and it was on the shore, and there was a long straight path so you could see it from the road, with a big porch and swings at both ends. A lot of grandchildren my age. And so young people would gather there, but older people, because she had two of her sons had never married and lived with her, even though that by the time I came along, they were probably in their 40s and 50s. And they both did a lot of fishing and stuff. But it was the kind of place that visitors to the island from the mainland, especially from Marshallburg, and Julian Bryan is who I'm speaking of now, who was a peddler. He'd come on the island to sell his wares and stuff. He'd always stop by Gracie's, especially in the morning, because she'd be cooking a breakfast for her extended family. And he would invited himself, because that's what he would have done if you had gone to his house. And so it is said that one morning there were more than a dozen sitting around the table, and she was just pumping out eggs and eventually everybody was up but Julian. And finally Julian took his last sip of coffee and said, "Aunt Gracie." if you fix any more eggs, can you scramble them? Anyway, and so that's been a benchmark that people refer to someone who who is never quite satisfied that he's finished eating and stuff. But anyway, that was the kind of things that happened at Grace's house. But the main character of that, in terms of life lessons and stories, would have been your great grandfather, Louis Hancock. My uncle, he lived right beside us, right between us and my grandfather's house. He was 18 years older than my father. So he was more like he was an older brother, but my father's mother had died when he was 4. And his father had remarried soon afterwards. So his brother, my Uncle Lou, was more like a daddy to my father.
I will interject that as I was young, I was often confused because I thought he was your dad's father, but
Yeah.
I was like, but then of course, once I
Yeah.
grew old enough to understand.
But their relationship was more like a father and son.
It was.
And he had, I don't think it was intentional. He had, I don't know what my father's education was only the 7th grade, and I doubt Louis had that much. But that we all called him Big Buddy. And he was surrounded by his brothers and sisters there at Hancock Landing and cousins on both sides and stuff. But he had a way of making deadpan announcements that he didn't really, I don't think he intended them to be funny, but they expressed things so well. For example, he had a chicken coop for years that finally, when the last chicken died, he tore down the pen and just extended his garden. And so you can imagine how fertile that garden was, having been a home to chickens for dozens of years or more.
Right.
And so when he planted some tomatoes, those tomatoes sprouted immediately and they were growing taller. So people would come from the neighborhood to see Louis' tomatoes. Well, Daddy said one morning they went there and Uncle Louis had pulled all of those tomatoes up before they had flowered but hadn't given fruit. And because when they start giving fruit, they start growing. They stop growing, so they assumed they were still growing. And when people asked him why, he said, "Well, because they were growing so fast, the noise was keeping me awake at nights." Another story he told about his daddy, he and my father had bought 2 goats for his son Louis Hallis and my brothers Tommy and Bill. And they stayed around Louis' house because he had a garden behind his house that they could feed off of. And he also had a pump on the back porch. You probably recall that you always had to have a can of water to prime the pump.
Right.
To create the suction. So there was always water on the back, and that's where the goats would drink out of that water. So they were always near that back porch. No fence or anything. The goats just stayed around there because that's where their food and water was. Well, evidently on one summer morning there was a thunderstorm. And it was really loud, and so Uncle Louis came down and laid on the sofa of what we called a day bed next to the window facing the porch. And in a real loud clap of thunder, it scared those goats so that they broke through the screen into the bed, sofa, day bed where my Uncle Louis was laying. And when Daddy heard the noise and went over, because it was a really loud clap of thunder, lightning must have been really close. Uncle Louis was there with just his, what he called union suit on, his night clothes. And Daddy asked him what was the matter, and he said, "I don't know. I just know I woke up with a goat in bed with me." So, and my favorite story about him, and I'll move on from this, is that he told us once about that during World War II when they were working on the bridge at Ocracoke, they were paying $1 an hour, which was the most anyone had ever heard for day labor. And so he headed up there to get a job one Sunday, but getting on the dock, his leg hit a nail and it started bleeding, so he came home. And he told me that story one day when I was telling him I was looking for a job, and that's how the story ended, that I came home. And so when I asked him what was the point, he said, "Oh, that's the closest I ever came to having a job." He lived to be 93 years old and never worked a day for anybody. He worked out of the water. He lived off what he grew, what he caught, what he harvested, and always had money in his pocket. Always. Okay, so that was the first group of stories about neighborhood people. And another group was just wise old sages that everybody knew and everybody would go to for advice or use as an example of some kind of virtue or character in life. One was what I would call my Uncle Telford. He was actually my great uncle. But he had a family of mostly girls. He had two sons, but then mostly girls that you would have known growing up and stuff. But Telford was somewhat of a sage, and everyone often quoted him and stuff. And it is said that once he had Brady Lewis build him the boat that he'd always dreamed of. Once he could afford to get that, and Brady, he was there every day overseeing what Brady was doing, and Brady got tired of it, and so he finally he asked Telford, because the thing, you had the choice: did you want to build a boat for fishing, or did you want to build her to go fast? Because racing boats was a big thing on the island. Mm-hmm. And Telford thought for a moment. He said, "Tell you what, you build her fast, and I'll fish her the best I can." But those were kind of stories from Telford. Then we're like at this we're sitting at the east end of the island at Shell Point. There was the Rose family, Cletus and Dallas Rose, two brothers from a large extended family there that were church going and talented men and kind. They were always trying to help other people and stuff. Dallas was also known for being a hard worker. He was the first fisherman out, the last fisherman in, every day. And it is said that one of his sons-in-law went with him one time, and when they came back in, it was almost midnight. And when he got Dallas asked him to go out to get the mooring so they could hot tie up the boat, notice there were tears in his eyes. And so Dallas said, "See, so what is the matter?" He said, "Why are you crying?" "We're home now," he says. "That just means in 2 hours we're going to leave again."
He dreaded it already.
And Cletus was just a kind heart, most gentle man in the world. One of his nephews he was a great carpenter that wouldn't drive the work with him because Cletus would pick up hitchhikers and take them where they were going. So on the way home, sometimes they'd get home after dark because Cletus had taken people wherever they were going. He would he was a great craftsman for both building boats and houses and furniture cabinets and things like that. He had all kinds of tools, and people were always borrowing them and forgetting to take them back. And so it is said that he posted a sign in Charlie Davis's store that if you'll start talking to me again, you can keep the tools, because he said that people would walk on the other side of the road so that he couldn't confront them about this stuff.
Because they knew.
But my favorite story is about, that one day he decided that he wanted to be a hunter like everyone else in the fall of the year. And if he was going to do it, he was going to do it the best. So at Easter Banks, he built a duck blind that was sort of like a hotel. And he had a lineup of guns and decoys of every fashion. And on the first day of hunting season, he was the first one over there. And it was laid out like a hunting club, but it was just for Cletus. And according to the story of one of his brothers that was with him, said that as the sun came up, a little, what we used to call a paddywhack, it was one of the smallest of ducks, landed right in the middle of his decoys. And so Cletus looked out of over the edge of the blind with his gun pointed, and as he did, the decoy looked up at him and sort of shook his head. And Cletus looked a few seconds more, and then dropped the gun and started waving his hand and said, "Why don't you fly somewhere before somebody shoots you?" Anyway, so he took up his decoys and his guns and gave the blind to other people. He just decided that was something he couldn't do. So another one who lived very close to you was Calvin Rose. He was a Rose. They would have been distant cousins, but he was a great boat builder and a commercial fisherman and stuff. In fact, when I came back from college, one of the big things in the fall was making money sink netting. And Calvin was one of those that made the most money. Everybody wanted to go with him because fishing is the most egalitarian thing in the world. A 16-year-old boy and a 60-year-old man make the same thing. You get a share. The owner of the boat gets a share, and the boat gets a share. That's the only difference between the Calvin and a boy like me working with him. So everybody wanted to go with him. And there was one guy on the island that had a reputation for not working real hard, but he asked Calvin one day if he could go fishing with him. And Calvin didn't want to hurt his feelings, but knew he didn't want to go fishing. He said, "Here's what to do. Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, you go to the dock. If the boat's there, it means we're not going. If it ain't there, it means you're not going." And so this guy, and I can tell you his name, said, "Thank you. Thanks for considering me. I'll be there."
I love that. Oh, that's hilarious.
Okay. And Lib Brooks told her one about going he lived up at the east end of the island on what they call Dead Man's Curve. And the story is that there were often wrecks there because it's very dark and there's no light. Even now, there's no light. And so people would run up into those oak trees there. And so one night, Lib and his daddy, JB, heard sirens and everything. There'd been an accident there. And they ran there. And when they got there, the patrolman was sitting in his car writing a report. And in the back of the car was someone he had arrested for drunk driving who had gone to sleep. Mm. Well, as he was writing the report and JB was talking to the officer, the man woke up and he didn't know her. So he said, well, what is it? And so the patrolman looked at back and said, well, there's a wreck. And the guy out the back said, well, who was it? He said, it was a drunk. And the guy said, oh, me, was I hurt? And now, one last one from this group of people. There was a guy on the island, and I mentioned his story and name in the book, that wanted to work on the ferry to drive supplies and stuff, but you had to have a license that allowed you to drive a bigger truck. And he couldn't get those licenses because he couldn't read. And so Hugh Salter, the ferry director, talked to the guy who ran, and he said, well, I'll get someone who will read it out loud to him so he can take the test orally. Mm-hmm. Now, in this world that I grew up in, that you may remember, Otwayers were considered, they were known for fast cars, they worked on dredge boats, they bought nice cars, and they drove real fast. So they were often involved in accidents and stuff. So in this, when he went to get his license, he was asked questions, and one of the questions was about unsafe movements. And so they asked him, Mr. Lewis, how would you describe an unsafe movement? He thought for a moment, he said, a drunk Otwayer passing a log truck on a curve. Wouldn't that be an unsafe? Wouldn't that be an unsafe movement? So she passed him.
Yeah, because that's perfect.
That was certainly an unsafe.
Absolutely.
And then the final chapter before the conclusion is about the special people, including what I would call Harkers Island professionals. You know, there were things, for example, there was Maxwell Willis, who was Karen, the director of the museum. His uncle, he was one of the first directors of the EMC, the REAF. So he was sort of like an engineer and a draftsman and all those things he could do, and he knew about he could direct all of the workers. Your father worked for him for years at the EMC, and he was a specialist in all of those things. Only had a high school education, but he was one of those. He was a techie in the days when techie meant radios, citizen band radios or UHF radios that you could listen to stations all over the world and stuff. Shortwave radios and stuff, but he was just a real techie that you had to do everything. Then there was Charlie Nelson, who was a self-taught surveyor, and I could see him as a boy carrying his equipment with him, which would be his tripods and his chains and stuff like that. And his handwriting was almost like calligraphy, so that now, if you see any of the deeds that he prepared, it looks like medieval documents and stuff. The beautiful handwriting and stuff. And if you wanted someone to draw up a will or a deed or something, like, he was the one you would go to. And one of the sayings on the island was, "Well, that boy's as smart as Charlie Nelson," or that so and so, because he was the standard by which you would measure those things. There was in my neighborhood Raymond Guthrie, who was like the Harkers Island lawyer. He also didn't have a high school education, but he was self-taught, and if you needed a letter written to Sears Roebuck because you wanted to return something that didn't work, he would write the letter for you. If you want a letter written to your congressman to try to get your son stationed closer to home in the Coast Guard, he would write the letter for you. Or if you wanted to apply to Cherry Point to get a job, he would fill out the application and stuff for you. So there were specialists. And then there was Earl Davis, my uncle, your mama's Uncle Earl, who was a jack of all trades. He did have an education. He graduated from the University of Tennessee, probably the first college graduate from the island. And he could and did do everything. I mean, he ran a store, and he did his own survey. He developed the land, including the land that this museum sits on, that he would later sold to the Park Service, and that they leased to the museum. And the land that I live on and that you grew up on was called, if you look at the deed, it says the Earl Davis subdivision.
Yep.
But he ran a movie theater on the island. He was the one that got him to bring telephone. He negotiated for the bringing of telephone lines. He was instrumental in getting the first bridge down, although he wanted the bridge to go to Lennoxville rather than to the Straits. And that's sort of a story in and of itself. And then the thing that I remember is in the late 60s, he applied through the REA, which he had been instrumental in getting the first. Harkers Island was the first community to get power by an underwater line,
Which is amazing.
that came from Lennoxville to Harkers Island, and he was on the board of directors and later director of that. In 1960s, he used that REA to apply for a grant for a water system on the island. Now you take it for granted, and I do, and my kids do. But before that, everything on the island depended on having a water pump, shallow well or deep well, subject to going down, or if the electricity was off, you had no water. If we had a cold spell, it froze, you had no water. And ever since then, people on the island have had fire insurance at less than half of the price of what it costs anybody else east of Beaufort because of that. But those were among the things that Earl Davis did that really set him apart as a professional on the island. I guess he's the only one you could say really was a professional. And I'm proud to say he was married to my Aunt Lee and my mother's oldest sister, and he was benevolent. Your mom and dad can tell you about when he sold land. He sold it at no interest,
Yeah.
and he financed it himself. That he would depend on you to bring him a payment, if it was every week or every month, depending on what it was, at about half the price that you would have bought the same land on the mainland. And one of the stories that I personally witnessed was there was a couple that had contracted with him to buy a piece of land, and they had paid for it for several years. And he lost his job, and the lady went to Earl and said, "I want to know if you would buy that land back and let us have our money." And Earl said, "Sure." And not only did he give her the money back, he gave her the money that was proportional to what he was charging for the land at that time. So if he had sold it for $2,000 and now was going to sell it for $4,000, he gave her twice what she had already paid on the land. That was the kind of guy. And my generation, your mother's generation, father's generation, wouldn't have had a place to live on the island had it not been for Earl, because all of the waterfronts on the side, which is where islanders wanted to live, that we talked about earlier, on the shore, landing, was gone. But now, when you cross the island bridge, in my youth, all you saw was virgin. You didn't see any houses. It was all just shoreline and cedars and pines and oaks. Now there's land, all of that because of Earl and Owen Fulford, his cousin. Then that last group of people were what I consider really special people for what they meant in my life and other people's life. And I mentioned on there, for example, Miss Ollie, who was sort of like she was the nurse doctor. If people couldn't afford to go to the doctor, couldn't get to the doctor and stuff. And so most neighborhoods had an older lady who might be a midwife, but who would be the ones that could treat cuts or bruises or lacerations and things of that sort. And Dr. Moore, who was the doctor, a doctor from Marshallburg, whose office was in Beaufort, but who had a house at the Banks. And when he was at the Banks, which was every weekend where he would go to rest, if you went to see him there, he didn't charge you anything.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, that was just, he knew that that's the reason why you come, because you couldn't afford to go through his office, because you'd have even if you couldn't pay, you had to owe him for it. It was said, some people said, I'd rather owe you all my life than beat you out of it. And then, there was a man on the island named Cecil Nelson that I tell about in my book, who later in life would not leave his yard, eventually would not leave his house and porch, and then eventually would not leave his room. Herman Melville wrote a story called Bartleby the Scrivener about a man like that. That became, I think of there is a word for it, and I use it in the book, but that his world and I call it the tiny world of Cecil Nelson, and some of the interaction that I had with him and other family, and that they could tell of stories involving, because he was pretty gifted, and he was an effective businessman. He had a clam house at the landing on his shore, and he sold and delivered clams, but eventually would have to hire people to get the clams for him, and people would have to come in his house to get paid and stuff. And
Wow.
I mentioned one other. I closed my book on the story of Luther Willis because it is sort of a paradigm for my life in that when I was in high school, I got a job mulleting with my uncles Calvin and Neil, that were Aunt Grace's sons, and Luther Willis. I was then probably 12 or 13, maybe 14, and Luther was in his 70s. He had fought in World War I in Europe.
Wow.
And they hired us because basically we didn't know hardly anything, but we could hold the staff on a net and help clear fish out of a net. He is an old man. And so when they would mulletin, when they would put a net out in the morning, and then they would go out and run that net out off the stern and make a circle that could bring it all back together. You had to estimate that. And sometimes you might be 100 yards short of having enough, so you had to pull it together.
Mm-hmm.
And on those situations, they had me. I was younger. I could get at the bottom and hold the lead line. He would pull at the top so he didn't have to bend over. And they would work the boat at the other end to pull it toward us. But I've thought about that since then. When Luther spoke, he always spoke by sucking air almost every breath. He was, by talking, he couldn't breathe well when he was talking. And I would later learn that was because he had fought in World War I and had been gassed in no man's land in 1918 when the United States entered the war there. And I thought about that, that he had never left Carteret County before. And he gets on a bus that takes him to Norfolk to get on a train that goes to Hoboken, New Jersey, where he was trained for a few weeks and then sent on a ship to Le Havre, France, and then trained into Paris, and then marched out into fighting World War I. What it must have been like to do. You've heard the expression, how do you keep them down on the farm once they've seen Paris? Well, in Luther's case, it wasn't the farm, but it was to landing. And he didn't change. He just came back to what he was and been. And when we were working and he would strain, he would gasp, and then he would say, "I ain't been the same since France." He would say that 20 times a day to explain, "I ain't been the same since France." And I never asked him anything about it. And I thought about what he could have told me, the stories and stuff that he could have told me. And I was interested in history then and have been, as you know, all my life. Yeah. And the stories that I could have listened to and then remembered and retold for Luther Willis. I do have a picture of him with his doughboy outfit on, and I was able to find the manifest from the boat that he was on that left New York and landed in Paris. That just lists his name and his date of birth, and that way I know that was him. And so those are some of the people whose special stories I tell, and I've rambled on. I haven't, and I hope I haven't taken too much time, but those are some of the stories of people that I want my children and your children to be able to know about if they're interested in knowing them.
No, you haven't rambled at all. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I am very grateful that you have taken the time and done the research and done the work, and for my kids, for me, but also for my kids. And now I can even say my grandkids, because you're right, that it's a shame that you didn't ask Luther those stories, because if we don't ask, if we don't read, if we don't share, then they're lost. And so you're helping preserve. And so
let me say, the stories that I've told are not because I asked anyone. It was because I just was around and heard them and have remembered them. But there's a lot of people of my age that heard the same stories that they just went in and out of their mind. But from the very first, they have stuck in my mind. Largely, I would say because of my brothers, because they would be the one, they would say, well, like Luther said, or like Charlie Lewis said, or like Brady said, or like what happened so-and-so, and it was repeated so many times that eventually you didn't have to tell the story, you just had to mention the name.
Right. So so that alluded to the story just by the name. Yeah.
I may have mentioned this in one of the earlier discussions, that Marjorie Hinckley said there's no one you wouldn't love if you knew the story. And one of the things that I came to love these people that I grew up about, because I know something about their story, and the people that read their stories will come to know a little bit about them too.
For sure.
There's another tradition in Hispanic culture that humans die twice. Once when they breathe their last breath, and another time when the last person that remembers them says their name out loud.
Wow.
And so in a way, I feel like that by writing down their names so that you can read it and I can read it and your grandchildren, that we give them a certain immortality, that we can live and laugh and love with some of the same people that my father and mother lived and laughed and loved with, and that maybe your grandchildren can live and laugh and love with and know their story.
That's beautiful. I really do love that. But the way you talk about these people, you can tell you love them, and you can tell that they're part of who you are. And that's because you spent time with them, with their story, with their memory.
When I tell those stories, every face I mentioned here, I saw their face. We know, I mean, they came alive again in just me speaking about them there. So we didn't have cell phones with the pictures then, but we did have stories, that are in some ways are just as real as the pictures that you look at or you show people on your phone.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so future plans. Do we have a volume 2 coming?
Well, Karen tries to encourage me to do that. Let me just say this. I started a blog called The Education of an Island Boy in 2011. And it would be stories just like this that would be posted individually. Your dad helped me with several of them. And especially I couldn't have done the one about Mississippi, the baseball player and stuff.
Yeah.
About your dad. And in my book, I used less than half of them because of space things and stuff. And so Karen wants me to do sort of like, a sequel. And I thought of a name like The Education of an Island Boy Second Semester, or After School.
I love it.
Or Higher Learning, or something of that sort.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm considering that. I've tried to gather them together to see if I could put them in some type of organized, some stories that will, I know it can't be just one continuous narrative because the stories don't go that way, but there are things that would bind them together as I've done in this one.
Right.
And so, yes, there are plans, but they are just plans for the time being, I hope. But winter is my time for thinking about those things because in summer I've got other things to do.
Yeah.
It was said of Rogers Hornsby, what do you do in winter? He says, I look out the window and dream of summer. That's
that's what we do. No, I love it. Well, I hope you do, because I visit your blog frequently, actually, and I've read all those stories, and so there are lots that need to be grouped together and need to be shared more widespread because they're just good, and the gems in them. Some of the things you've said today, I mean, the sayings and stuff, like I've heard them, but every time they just crack me up. I had not heard the one that you said about Calvin, about if the boat's here, then we're not going. And if it's gone, you're not going. That's hilarious. That's really funny.
Your uncle, Billy Paler, was the one who told me that.
I love it. I do. Mr. Calvin, he was a card. He was good to me. I was a little girl next to him, and he loved me, and I loved him, his curls.
Calvin was one of those people you heard him before you saw him.
You did. Like, that's not a hyperbole. Yeah. He really did. Well, Joel, thank you again. As always, it has been a pleasure, and I could listen to you for hours and hours.
Well, you have.
I have. That's
you already
true.
have.
But please, again, I mean, you're welcome anytime to talk about anything.
Well, I've done several book clubs, maybe half a dozen or more. I'm doing another one Monday for a book club in Morehead City.
Oh, fun.
And stuff. So the word does, it hasn't spread widely, but there are some people that that it catches on with, and they want to hear more about it.
I love it. And that's wonderful. Well, thank you. And I love you.
Thank you, and I love you too.
Thank you again for joining us to The Landing. This podcast is brought to you by the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center. I am your host, Stacy Davis Baisden, and today's podcast was produced by April Davidson. Tune in next week as we continue learning, sharing, and remembering together. If you'd like to hear more, check out our previous episodes where you get your podcasts. Until then, stay safe and be kind.